Cool. We're recording. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Oh my gosh, more people keep joining. To the Moving Monolithic Applications to Kubernetes open source call. The point of the call is to discover the point of the call. But it seems like we're all here and we all have either opinions or at least curiosity around moving larger, what I sort of imagine as legacy applications to Kubernetes. To start off, I think we should just go around and just give quick intros and just like if you can let people know your experience, like if you're just curious, if you've done this before, if you are in the process of doing it, if you want to do it when you grow up, whatever your case may be. And again, if you don't want to talk, you don't have to, but I think it's good to kind of let us know who we're dealing with and give everybody a chance to say hi. So I'll go first. I am Chris Nova. I work at Heptio. My whole involvement here has been like, it started off as like a Twitter thread that has now turned into this enormous meeting that we're recording and sharing with the open source community. So anywhere I see like a problem space in Kubernetes, I'm instantly addicted. Like to me, like that's like gold. So if people are struggling in this space, I definitely want to explore it and make sense of it and see if I can help make the community better. So I'm going to go across the screen and just try to keep it quick because more and more people keep joining. But Chris Short, can you just give us a quick update?
Yeah, I'm interested in this space because of multiple people I know saying, yes, we want to adopt Kubernetes, but no, we don't think we can move our workloads over into containers. So kind of breaking that down and saying, yes, you can. This is how.
Okay. Craig?
Oh, hey. I was mainly curious. I have almost 1 week experience with Kubernetes. So, and we have a lot of .NET applications and some Go applications, mainly backing a lot of interval data from electric meters. Now I'm just trying to figure out where we can push this data to be more resilient for our customers.
Okay.
So.
Cool. Aditya?
Hi, I'm Aditya. I work on observability at Stripe. We are adopting Kubernetes for at least some portions of our infrastructure, but I'm also interested because I primarily work on an open source tool called Veneur, which is an observability pipeline and also does support Kubernetes. So it's good to hear what other people who use Kubernetes, particularly in larger monolithic environments, what their needs are.
Okay, cool. Sophie?
Hey, I'm Sophie Haskins. I work at GitHub. I'm on GitHub's SRE team, and I'm here. I have been a part of the project where we ported GitHub's monolithic stack to Kubernetes. That might be a bit of a misnomer, but the more big part, like a lot of it runs on Kubernetes now. And yeah, I'm curious about other people's experiences with similar things.
Cool. Nick Shuck. Okay, I'm gonna go past that person. Dodana Behane.
Donica.
Okay, sorry. I'm really sorry if I butchered anybody's name.
No, that's fine. I haven't actually set up my account properly on Zoom. I'm chief architect at a company called Populo in Ireland, and we've a 11-year-old monolith, and we're in the process of migrating it to Kubernetes. Right now, just test environments so far, but in the next few months, maybe 6 months, we're hoping to get it into production.
Cool. C. Tracy?
Hey, Chris, this is Craig from Heptio. Sorry, I'm joining a little bit late.
Yep.
I'm a solutions engineer at Heptio.
Awesome. Good to see you. Okay. I picked on all the people who have their video turned on because I feel like they're a little more open to share and or talk. If anybody else wants to give an intro. Oh, it looks like Nick Santa is joining the party.
Yeah, I'll join the party. So I work for a Drupal agency in Australia. We've been running monolithic Drupal applications in Kubernetes for 1.5 years in production. So yeah.
Yay. We got some production users. That's awesome. Sean, I'm going to pick on you.
So I'm Sean, otherwise known as Savvy. People might know me as the Corgi on Twitter. I am mostly interested in Kubernetes because I haven't worked with it too much before, and it seems pretty interesting. Plus, we're right now basically breaking up it's sort of a monolith, not entirely a monolith, into smaller pieces, and the deployment mechanism we'll be using is Docker, which is a change for us, but also our ops team is looking at us as an experimental way to use Kubernetes. Additionally, there is a piece of our software that will run on premise and that will need to coordinate containers. And there's an opportunity for that piece to use Kubernetes if possible. And so running Kubernetes outside of our own control, if you will. And so I'm really interested to just sort of get more experience with the product at all, technology overall, and just to find out if that's even a good idea.
Okay. Sophia Profana?
Oh, hi. I'm Sophia. I work at Docker, and as you know, we've started supporting Kubernetes, which I actually know very little about. So definitely interested in learning more about Kubernetes, and also I'm on the team that does a lot of the migration type stuff as well. So
awesome. Justin Hart.
Hi there, I'm Justin. I'm the platform architect for Ibotta. We have a 5-year-old monolith in Ruby, and we are currently splitting that out into a few microservices targeting Kubernetes. We started on Elastic Beanstalk, but going towards Kubernetes, and the plan is to move the monolith into Kubernetes to help accelerate continuing to split those out.
Okay, cool. Okay, I'm going to move on since we're already about 10 minutes in, unless anybody else wants to jump in. Now is the time to do that.
Hey, sorry, my audio stuffed up before. First time Zoom user. So my name's Nick Xu, based in Australia, work with Nick Santa Maria. Yeah, we're a Drupal web agency, so we're just cranking out the monoliths, basically. So yeah, cool.
Cool. Okay, I'm going to say that's good on intros. During these next few minutes, if you want to jump in, feel free to cut me off as we start doing some self-organizing stuff if you really want to give an intro. But now, if everybody has the Google Doc open, there is this big open section under agenda where there's a bunch of, well, they're almost ellipses. If there was one more dot, they would be a proper ellipse. But we're going to do the unconference style self-organization, where if you have an idea or something you want to talk about, we're going to go ahead and add that to the list, and then everybody's going to get 2 votes, and we're going to go in and we're going to vote these, and we'll go in priority order. When we get to the end, I'll try to save about 15 minutes or so for action items and next steps. One of the things I'd very much want to go over at the end of this call is, do we need to have more of these calls? And if so, in what form? Is this a Kubernetes official SIG kind of thing, or like what's going to benefit us, the community, the most? So everybody's going to get started now writing great ideas in the Google Doc. I've already put one in there, which is, what does a monolith mean to you? Which I think is really important for us to define before we start talking about moving a monolith over. So monoliths can come in a lot of different forms. So we'll give everybody a few minutes, and remember, you get 2 votes, and how we're going to vote is just at the very beginning. We'll have a number, like I'll vote for my own here. It keeps moving. You guys are all doing really great. So that's 1 vote for what does monolith app mean to you. If you want to increase that number by 1 to use one of your votes, go for it. Doc link, please. Yeppers, peppers. I'm going to do my best to keep an eye on the chat, but if I miss anything, somebody yell at me. Oh, and then also, just as an FYI, the attendees, like, we just want to have an idea of people who are on the call in case we need to follow up for anything. That's really the only reason why we're collecting this information, just to get an idea of what and who the community is, and so we can stalk you and like all your cute pictures on Twitter, especially Sean's, because he has the best dog.
Hey, Chris, how many times do you want us to vote here?
Everybody gets 2 votes.
2, thank you.
Yep. No cheating. We're on the honor system. I'm watching everybody. Yay. There's a Shanksy picture. Okay. And I'm going to put a line break. Actually, no, I'm just going to let you guys do your thing. I don't want to mess this up anymore. There's so many like people typing right now. Oh, these are some good ones. So I'm trying to add little brackets to the front of these, but it's proving to be quite challenging. Okay, so we have 4 votes for what does a monolithic app mean to you. So being that I'm a benevolent dictator, I'm going to say we're going to start off there while the rest of us kind of think and spend our votes and finish working on the doc. So I've kind of talked about my questions that I have, but I'm really just curious, everyone else, like, what does a monolith mean to you? And then I guess, what is the line in the sand, right? Like, when do you move from a monolithic app with more than one responsibility principle into a microservice? Like, what does that mean to everyone here? Ready, go. I'll call on people, I really will.
One of, I feel like most of my career I've worked at a couple of similarly sized companies that have what they would have described as a monolithic web stack. And I think that one of the characteristics that was, is most defining of them is that it's like a single code tree. A lot of people lately have been talking about mono repos, where maybe they have multiple projects under one physical repo and do some interesting things because of that. But I think that at some level, like GitHub is a Rails app, and it's one Rails app, and the root is the root of a Rails app. And I think that that kind of organization principle, where the subparts of a monolith are not themselves fully contained apps, but instead there's only one normal structure, is usually how I approach it.
Okay, I would very much agree with that. And then in a weird sense, Kubernetes is also kind of a monolith on that note as well. But yeah, I think like when you look at a large structure of code, right? Like right now, if we want to share resources between 2 different components of the app, that's done using hardware resources. So that's usually transmitted through memory. As we start looking at taking a monolithic app and building it into smaller single responsibility components, that will probably still be in memory for some portion of its lifetime, but it's going to eventually traverse the network, which is a big defining feature, I feel like, between monolithic apps and microservices, which is the network is how they communicate and not through shared memory within the context of a program. Which is important because as we start looking at moving monolithic apps, the network is going to be one of the things that we really start opening up, I have a feeling. Anybody else have any thoughts here?
Yeah, that's what was described earlier, one solution, one project, or one app backed by a database where you can, ship it as one big binary or tarball that has every single feature for everything. And if the application or database goes down, basically the entire thing goes down.
So single points of failure.
Yeah. Or at least for the monoliths, I wrote it one time.
Wait, show of hands, who here has worked on a monolith at some point in their career? Okay, so that's why we're all here. It's because we've all been bitten in the ass by this thing. Okay. Hand. Noah raised a hand. Oh, lots of people vow too. Okay, cool. But yeah, I do feel like in a monolith, like I remember the first one I wrote, we had a MySQL connector is what we called it, but it was basically the shared MySQL. It was object-oriented Java, and we would instantiate a singleton, and that would be how we connected to the database. And if for whatever reason that class failed in some way, the entire program would come to a crashing halt. Anybody else do anything like that?
I think that hits on something that someone mentioned in a later question about difference between languages, where I think with interpreted languages, monoliths sometimes end up having multiple deployable, like multiple entry points to the same code base. So using GitHub as the example, there are at least 3 Rails apps or 3 different like starter points, scripts to start the Rails app that run different sets of routes and stuff like that. We also have like async workers that run in separate daemons. And I think it's possible that in compiled languages, it's more likely to have a single binary that like you said, communicates over shared memory and maybe does all of those things in one process.
Right.
But I think that it's in some cases having like that multi-entry point comes up.
Yeah, definitely. I can see that in interpreted languages especially. And in a weird way, Kubernetes is also kind of like that. Like there's a huge library, then there's like all these different small binaries that use bits and pieces of the main library.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've got many Java apps communicating via shared database, so we've got a distributed monolith. I'm sure we're not.
Yeah, I'm curious if there's any kind of opinion of like distributed monoliths. I've worked with a lot of Java applications where like each applet or class or whatever you call them in Java is like in itself an independent function, but they all are intertwined to the same database backend or some underlying service that they have to talk to.
Yeah. Well, I think in that point, that kind of follows that same pattern that we were talking about earlier with monolithic apps using memory or a shared data store to communicate between themselves. And then in microservices, like unique data stores, we're traversing the network. We kind of don't care how we get there. Like there's a whole other stuff going on.
Maybe one of the challenges you get with
sorry, that could be even worse if you have separate executables and a shared database. Then you end up in a situation where teams block each other a lot. So.
Yeah, I remember one of the first applications I worked on. We had we had PHP and we had Java, both object oriented, and they each had like this magic layer on top of a Mongo database. I know this was a long time ago, and one of them would manipulate the data in a way that the other one didn't. So we ended up with all this data corruption. Has anybody else ever seen? Yeah, shaking your heads.
Yes.
Yeah.
So much that.
So much that. Okay. Okay, so I think I'm going to go look at our agenda here. Can we sort this? Actually, there's probably a low enough number. I can just do this in my head. I think we have a good idea of kind of like the problem spaces, like what we're seeing in monolithic apps, and then we can start to move into these other topics. But at least now we kind of have a shared understanding of what we're all seeing and what all the pain points are. So I'm going to jump into this big number 7 by Anonymous Otter here. How do you observe or monitor your services pre-Kubernetes? What would your ideal observability toolkit look like with Kubernetes? Yeah, I'm going to +1 that. It's going to give me an 8. So that's a great question. Anybody want to start?
So I know pre-Kubernetes, as someone who hasn't really used it before, traditional ways to monitor or observe services, you're looking at your Datadogs, your New Relics, your custom Sensu integrations, your CloudWatch scripts. Really, like in most places I've worked that have had some type of setup around this, it's usually some, I'm going to use the phrase mishmash of different services that all lead into one or usually many more disparate dashboards that if you're lucky, you have all those dashboards in one place, but maybe on different pages. And if you're not lucky, it's a couple of different products where you have to keep them all open at once. And it's hard to sort of get that high level sort of knowledge driven approach to, oh, something over here went wrong. Also, there's a bunch of the things over here that went wrong, but I don't know that. I don't always have that knowledge that ties them together, right? So I know that that's been true for places that I've worked in the past that were lucky enough to even have any type of monitoring setup, which is a different story. So I'm definitely interested to find out like how people tie directly into Kubernetes to sort of gauge the health and the sort of troubleshoot their systems.
Okay, so I'm going to try to nutshell that without taking away any of the important bits and pieces, because I think I've seen the same thing in my past experiences, which was there was this sort of like superficial human layer that would glue all of these arbitrary input sources together. And then that human was able to like reconcile that and say, oh, there's a problem, and oh, there's not a problem, or oh, we need to take action. And being able to automate that component of the system is probably what we're all excited about moving to Kubernetes.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. So yeah, I'll start off with a concrete example. In the past, I used Nagios. or as I liked to call it, NAG iOS. That was a joke. Anyway, it was just kind of like a reactive exercise. Like something would go wrong and we would like write an Nagios plugin for it. And then like we would just have it watch it over and over again. And if you were on call and you got, I think, a critical, it was like stop everything and go in and take action. Does that sound familiar to anybody else? Okay.
Yes, but I hated Nagios and still do.
Yeah, it worked for like, I don't know. It had its pros and cons. Once you got real good at it, you got real good at it.
I've been lucky enough not to have to work with it, but everyone I know who has worked with it has told me that I am lucky that I have not had to work with it.
Yeah. Okay. No, go ahead.
Sorry, as I say, I'm happy to share. I was the person who asked this question, and so I think that my experience is probably the least useful, but just in the interest of fairness. So we write our own observability stack, or at least the pipeline. So we are dependent on third-party tools for our actual like storage, and so we use things like Datadog or like Splunk, Kibana, like those sorts of tools as well. But we own the actual pipeline that's collecting and instrumenting them. We're in the process of, it supports Kubernetes, we're in the process of expanding that. And so I asked because I wanted to get it from other people, what are the things that you have liked or disliked about the tools that you've used? Fortunately, I think it seems like what people are saying matches kind of what we expected to hear, which is reassuring.
Okay. Does anybody have any stories about successfully setting up or unsuccessfully setting up monitoring Kubernetes around a monolithic app today?
Spent kind of a lot of time on this earlier this year, or I guess it's last year now. We at GitHub we use Datadog, and directly connecting the app to Datadog wasn't particularly different in Kubernetes beyond like a certain amount of bootstrapping. But what was different is that a lot of people make a lot of assumptions about things being host-based, and monitoring is one of the places where that shows up the most concretely. And so understanding how we can tag things or whatever is the appropriate word in a given environment, but sort of apply metadata that helps people select what they want and also slice it down to the units that they care about. And if you're doing a model where one host is one instance of your app in your classic deployment, then you've also implicitly sort of made this ability to slice by like process by slicing by host. And when we started running more than one daemon per host on Kube, we lose that, right? And some systems are not that good at high cardinality things. Some are, but you run into weird things.
Absolutely. Aditya you and I talked about this a lot in Vail, which was like once you start crossing that like one-to-one versus one-to-many in a distributed container environment, like things get real interesting real quick.
Yeah, we've switched from Zabbix to, we're still using Zabbix, but we're using Prometheus on our legacy infrastructure, and Prometheus is what we're doing with all our Kubernetes. We have some production microservices as well, so everything Kubernetes is using Prometheus now, and we're pretty happy with that. It's working pretty well.
I've heard a lot of good things about Prometheus. I haven't used it myself, but I am curious if anybody else here has used it and what they have to say about it.
I haven't used it with Kubernetes, but I've definitely used it elsewhere, and it is very good, but it's kind of like Nagios in the sense that it's very domain specific. You have to dive into it pretty deep to make full use of it.
Yeah. Marco had a question. Anybody have a conf link/ID? Marco, what are you looking for? I'm going to paste the Google Doc just in case that's it. And it looks like null +1 Prometheus. Okay. So Aditya, earlier you had mentioned observability. I was wondering if we could explore that word a little bit more and what that means to you and the rest of everybody here.
That's a great question. I have strong opinions about this, but would someone else like to go first before I share mine? Okay, I mean, I'm happy to share mine. So observability is related to monitoring, but it is I would say like one layer deeper or one layer beyond, like kind of like the meta level. So the way that we think of observability is the difference between gathering and automating data based on your known unknowns, which are your monitors. You know when something goes down based on certain pieces of data and units of data, versus your ability to actually investigate and explore those on an arbitrary basis. Observability is kind of in that sense the parent component, the parent concept that underlies monitoring. Monitoring is one special case of it. There are a couple of, if people are interested in this distinction, like there are a couple of great posts that I can link to that highlight this in more detail, but on a very practical level, it helps you, how do you answer for yourself the questions, is my service up? If it's not up, who do I page? What do they do next? How do they actually fix it? And how do I know when it's back up again? The tools that you use to answer those questions once the page has already been sent, or before the fact to determine when the page gets sent, those are your observability tools.
Awesome. Anybody have anything else on that?
What's the opinion of the different, like which phases of the deployment are included in observability? I think from my perspective, that includes a lot of the, the build pipeline from CI to CD. So, a fully observable system would be able to track, a given commit essentially from commit to the repository all the way through to the log lines that get and metrics that get generated.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we've all I've worn the SRE and infrastructure hat most of my career. I've seen problems occur long before the first commit ever gets made. And I've seen problems occur long after we swore that we unplugged that server from the rest of the rack. So it really, observability to me can happen at any point in that life cycle. And I think that just kind of depends on, what does your specific use case look like? Most monolithic apps I've worked on in the past had bits and pieces of the CI/CD pipeline automated, but it was still kind of this hand-holding exercise to get it through the door. I think now in Kubernetes, we're seeing a lot of you make a commit and bam, you get a container and it's running, and that's how you're developing now. Tools like Draft and some of the other deployment things are kind of doing that for us, even on save, which is before a commit. So yeah, I think observability is anywhere along the pipeline. Cool. So I'm going to take an action item here. In the name of monitoring and observability, it sounds like we're all kind of looking for some common definitions and maybe some user stories or reviews or opinions on different tools and what they've tried. Would that be valuable to everyone? Cool. Okay. I will take this first one because there's going to be a little bit of understanding where and how we want to start sharing this data with the community. In the past, when we did this for SIG AWS and other parts of Kubernetes, we put everything in GitHub. But I think probably a different conversation for a different time that we don't need to get everybody involved in right now. As long as it's free and open and you can contribute to it, I think we're all usually pretty happy. Okay. And I can do that during our next talk. So let's move on to the next subject, unless anybody has anything else here. Going once. Cool. So that was a 7 or an 8. We did, what does monolithic app mean to you? Looks like we have a 4. Let's go with this one. How is the process of moving an app to K8s different between monoliths and non-monoliths? Another great question. It looks like we had a question in chat. How do we link observability at multiple levels of abstractions? I don't really understand the question. I.e. infrastructure as a service, IaaS and PaaS. Oh, you're saying how, like, at different layers of the stack, how are we linking observability between them? Yeah. I'll put that in my action item to include an open question for that. Sounds good.
Yeah, for the question of how those two things differ, my team's main purpose is actually supporting the non-monolith services, and we only undertook porting GitHub's monolith as a way of like getting the most traffic through Kube and gaining experience running clusters. And the thing that's the biggest difference between that process and how it's worked with much smaller apps is monoliths tend to be a sort of diffuse responsibility. One of the reasons that they end up the way that they are is that no one is fundamentally responsible for it because that's not possible. And much smaller apps, it becomes possible for the people who are writing it to be in some sense responsible for it. And so the difference is that when you're migrating a monolith, I think often the team who's undertaking that, and whoever that is you know, I can't answer for your org, but kind of has to take responsibility for a lot of things that they have no control over. And with, you know, microservices moving to K8s, it's much easier because you know who's responsible for what, and it's easier to define what correct behavior is. Whereas with a monolith, it could be lost to the sands of time. It's you know, has a large number of edges, and not all of them are known, and not all the dependencies are necessarily known, and so that's, you know, the responsibility chain.
Awesome. Great answer. Did that help you out? I don't know how to pronounce your name. My app, maybe? Okay, so back to number 4 on our list here. How is the process of moving an app to Kubernetes different between monoliths and non-monoliths? Just to get the conversation started, to me, if you have a non-monolithic app, that implicitly means it's a single responsibility, which means getting that app into a container and deploying Kubernetes is usually significantly easier. Why it's easier, we can discuss as a team, but that's my experience. Anybody else have any thoughts there? Who asked the question? I'm going to pick on you.
Hi, this is Dan. I asked the question. Yeah, I was just wondering, because my video is not working. Yeah, I was just wondering, kind of, generally when you read about Kubernetes, it looks really straightforward. You just throw something in a container and you throw it up and it all just works. And I'm kind of curious what additional complexities there are with monoliths. I mean, you know, when you chose to do this Zoom meetup or whatever we're calling it, Hangout, there was a reason you chose to talk about monoliths in particular. I'm kind of curious what made you, what's special about monoliths that why are we talking about monoliths?
So for me, the answer to that is, as in my career, as I went through the exercise of finding myself in a world of monoliths, whether or not I intended for them to be there or not, it was just sort of a necessary part of my career. I lost my train of thought. I started looking at moving into containers and running things as a service in a containerized environment, and implicitly the way you set up your software is kind of different, to the point of where, like, let's take a 3 gigabyte Java binary. And I want to run that as a microservice. Like, that whole compilation process is going to be a little bit more noisy, and getting that into a container is going to be a little bit harder. But ultimately, like, maybe it's just not fundamentally set up to be ran as a small service. Like, maybe we kind of need all these other bits and pieces in place, and pulling those apart into containers is like an engineering activity and not so much like an infrastructure activity. Like, it's going to be a code change. And to me, that's exciting.
Yeah, I think startup times can be significant in a monolith. Or also, for us, we've state in our monolith. So we need stickiness. If we want multiple instances, we need sticky sessions.
Did I lose you guys?
Nope.
Nope. Okay.
I think the other thing about bringing a monolith to Kubernetes is the idea. This is not really a new idea. It's this is something we've been preaching since the IaaS cloud era. But the application has to be both accepting of the fact that it may get killed, it may get rescheduled, and for a lot of monoliths that are written, typically you find that that's not the case. That they don't have a way to gracefully stop and restart.
Yeah, that's a good point. So yeah, again, I think it goes back to that whole, like, we structured an application to be ran maybe as like a Linux service that does a ton of things, or maybe we structured it to be ran as sort of a control loop, but not quite really a control loop. And we have the logic there, but just the way we're framing that logic doesn't make the most sense in a containerized environment.
The hard thing with some monoliths that I've run into is that your local dependency, like the dependencies of what's on the server that you deploy to, are sometimes a little bit difficult to determine. They're like, because perhaps they are set up in a separate system than the code is, right? So, we found that there was a local HA proxy running that proxied some but not all of the services that people were talking to from the web app, and so we ported that as a separate container. But like discovering its existence and its purpose and its design can get hard because there's sort of this implicit set of dependencies in addition to the clearer ones.
Yeah. I found when I was moving a virtual machine environment into Terraform, we kind of did that same exercise, which was like, even discovering all of the weird, goofy stuff running on all the servers was kind of more important than the actual like little bit of configuration that like came out of the whole exercise. I think moving to Monolith you're going to see that same pattern of, we actually kind of need to know what we're doing and how we're doing it, and we need to have a really good resource for that.
Well, that may also have ramifications on your whole build process, right? Because if you think about it, typically you don't see Python applications that are monoliths. That's not to say that they can't be there, but like a Python application may require dependencies that are living on the system itself. So is it a mix? Like, have you always been relying on configuration management to deploy this application to a server, and then relying on the fact that some Python module just happens to be in the system path? But now you're actually pushing that all into a container, which may have implications on how you build that application going forward.
Yeah.
And even when you're lucky enough to have, configuration management and somewhat automated provisioning of hosts, sometimes that configuration management lives in a gigantic multi-hundred thousands of files Puppet repo, and it's just as inscrutable as if it weren't there.
Right.
That's definitely not from experience.
Yeah. I think another sort of like interesting thing to point out here, though, is like with a containerized environment, like as long as you can encapsulate whatever it is you need the system to look like, getting it into a container, it's a bit of an investment. It might take some time to get it all working right, but once you have it, you're kind of like, you're good. You at least made it to that point, and you can, let that sit there for a while and focus on other things that are on fire. So I feel like we spend a lot of time picking on containers, but that's actually a really big plus in my mind.
Yeah, there's also things like logs, like going from like an older system with a whole bunch of VMs, and like the infrastructure team have their own logging under the hood, and you've got your monolithic app that just goes to syslog and it's off to the ops team. But then moving to something like Kubernetes or containers, it's all standard out, standard error, like having that kind of shift. But you're also all for the better for it, I believe, too. So getting those kind of best practices in place, or cron jobs, like the mysterious cron job on an EC2 instance somewhere that runs the batch operation for that monolith in the background. Moving that to Kubernetes cron jobs has been awesome for us because the devs can actually add more cron jobs without coming and poking at the ops team to say, hey, we need this thing on this host to run every couple of minutes. So there's definitely like a big investment up front, but in the long run, you have this kind of really nice declaration of what your monolith does. So
I think that's a really good point. And something that we haven't, I don't think, mentioned yet is that there's actually a human cost as well. So I work with customers big and small, and one customer that I work with in particular, that as they move to Kubernetes, one of their biggest problems is that their operations teams are used to reading logs by SSHing into the server and going to read the log and figuring what's going on and then remediate the problem. And now you have to retrain people to like, okay, hey, now you're going to Kibana or some other tool like Splunk to go look at these logs. And oh, by the way, when you get logs in Splunk and Kibana, it's not always obvious that something like a stack trace, which is multi-line, is going to end up in Splunk or Kibana and look sane. So I think there is also a human cost here.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to add that. That's a really good point.
And I can only imagine what it'd be like to have bespoke built monoliths. For us, we're really lucky that because we build a lot of our stuff in Drupal, like we can kind of put it like do it once and then feed it into like a common scaffold for bootstrapping new projects, say like logs to stand it out. But yeah, I like having done that once, I can totally see how there's that massive investment moving bespoke apps to Kubernetes.
Okay. Would it be helpful if I added logging to the list of things that we wanted to add to this resource we're going to come up with? I see people shaking their head and giving me a thumbs up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
Yeah, I think when we were setting up our cluster to start with, that was one of our initial goals, was ensure that we had a way to pick up logs and pick up monitoring, whether it be StatsD or whatever we needed. That was sort of prerequisite for us to start putting services in there.
Yeah, absolutely. Has anybody had any problems with logging and moving a monolithic over? Anybody care to share horror stories?
We're using Sumo Logic, and they've got a very nice container that can run as a daemon set, and it actually uses Fluentd underneath, and that's worked really well for us. Actually fewer problems doing that than running their binary on the machines themselves.
Awesome.
We had a fun incident when, so our logs go to standard out, and then we have a daemon that scrapes them from whatever the horrifying path on disk is that Docker puts them in, and send them to syslog, where they eventually get slurped up by Splunk. And the syslog hosts ended up creating a lot more files than they used to, because they ended up being based on pod name instead of host name. And the folks responsible for logging weren't super thrilled with us.
That's a really good one. So I think there's like we have some experiences here. And I think having a place where we can come together and share and provide a good, meaningful data source is going to be a really good output of this call. Cool. Yay, hooray, meeting output. I always wish that meetings were like a good function signature where you had to define the output beforehand, but like sometimes you're just not that lucky, and it's just like it just returns an anonymous interface, and what we get is what we get. Okay, cool. I'm going to move on to the next one, and we have about 13 minutes left. So I'm going to say we have one more item. If anybody has any super strong opinions about something they want to talk about, feel free to shout it out now. And if not, I will go to the one that has the next highest amount of votes. Okay, I thought I saw another 4 in here, but it looks like it moved.
Some of that pain points one.
Oh yeah, pain points. Integration with legacy database systems. Who all voted for that one? What do you guys want to get out of this? Is this just pain points in general? Just like who's done this and what was the hardest part, or is this specifically related to databases?
So for me, it was the first one, right? We're just beginning to consider doing this migration, and if there's some heads up on what's going to give us trouble that we may not have anticipated, that would be great to know now.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to rephrase this one because I kind of have the same question here, and I'm going to say, getting started, pain points, and more importantly, gotchas. And I feel like there's probably a good, like, it's probably 50-50, just general moving to Kubernetes. Like, you could have the world's greatest microservice app, and you're probably still going to get snagged along the way. And then also, specifically with monoliths, what are some things that is really going to bite you? I feel like logging and monitoring are going to be the big ones here.
Might be some pain points specific to containerization as well.
That's a great one. One of the things I really want to start exploring is specifically related to Java and JVM, which is, as a user, what does it look like to run an app on a virtual machine inside of a container that's another abstraction on top of the kernel, on a different host operating system? Like, there's so many layers between what you write as a software engineer and what the system is actually going to process at the end of the day. That, to me, seems like a really interesting exercise to go through. But in general, like, I'll be honest, when I started using Docker, it took me about 3 months before I felt comfortable writing a Docker file and really trusted that it was going to do what I told it to do. Has anybody else hit that as they've been journeyed? Tehu's raising your hand. Yeah. Okay.
So Chris, I've actually seen a little bit of the opposite experience, and this is not the team I work on, but I know we have a group that has written Java applications, and they're generally hosted in WebSphere. For cost reasons, we had hoped to move that to Tomcat, and the infrastructure team that supports this decided that they were going to take candidate apps and stick them into containers. So there's a single application in the container, and then they were just going to host it in as sort of a general, Docker runtime in a VM. And they were able to do this actually without involvement or knowledge of the application developers, that they were being hosted in a different environment. It was actually very transparent.
Ooh, this is great. I mean, this is just like a thought experiment I've been going on. I don't really have any real data to back this on. But you're saying that it was essentially a seamless migration from an engineering perspective?
I am, but most, this is a carefully selected subset of all of the Java applications, right? It's mostly looking at UI or other stateless stuff to make sure it was very easy. But from that perspective, it was seamless. Now, on the other hand, the developers did not get the advantage that you might see from containerization, like being able to develop rapidly in their local environment and seeing the same sort of thing in production. But just from a infrastructure team, and the infrastructure team getting the advantage of being able to upgrade these applications and their dependent libraries independently, patch them independently, rather than trying to patch a large WebSphere type environment and, one of the applications failed, now I have to roll it back. Getting out of that environment was very beneficial to that team.
That's awesome. That's a great win. I need a good win today.
One of the gotchas on the JVM is, until recently, the JVM was unaware of C group limits, so it would just see the entire memory and core count of the machine. Now that's been fixed in recent Java versions to some extent. It's a gotcha.
Give me 1 second. I'm taking notes. You said there's a C group limitation for the JVM?
No, it's just unaware of the limits. So your CPU and memory limits. So the default settings on the JVM are for the entire host machine.
Got it.
That's fixed in Java 9, and I think it's experimental flags in recent versions of Java 8.
Yeah, 131 or later of Java 8. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good point that there are, any other app that might be looking at counting the number of CPUs or whatever. You got to make sure that it's sort of container aware and that it's using the number of CPUs that are available to the container, not to the host system.
See, I think our team mitigated that by just launching their Tomcat instances with specific memory and CPU constraints, if I recall correctly. And part of what I'm only half remembering is that the amount of memory you told the JVM didn't correspond in an obvious way to the amount of memory that the Docker environment would enforce. Does this half thought make sense to anybody?
Yeah, no, it does. This is one of the things I was kind of thinking about was like, I know so many of these monolithic Java apps are so like dependent on having the JVM like dialed in just right. I was kind of worried that when the second we move into a container, we're going to lose a lot of that stuff. But it sounds like it's with a few minor tweaks, you're able to kind of wrap your horns around it again.
Have JVM folks experienced problems with sort of boot up time and how Kubernetes deploys work? Our boot up is not as long as I feel like I hear is the case in the Java lands, but even the fact that like they were not doing hot reloads because the containers get replaced has been annoying, or I guess it's a change in how we do things.
It's a good point. I've seen that the container startup times would be considered quite painful in some environments. I think 10, 20 seconds sometimes. For our kind of environment, that's not a problem. That's not the advantage we're really trying to get.
I think another interesting, like maybe this is specific to monoliths, but during deploys and that kind of like usage of stuff, the fact that that we can't like overpack. I guess when we did rolling deploys with non-containerized things, you do a deploy where maybe you run 2 instances of the app on the same box and use up its the resources and only one of them gets the requests or whatever. But in Kube, like we need to have this headroom because we can't hint to the scheduler. And during startup, it won't actually use that much CPU because it's not taking requests yet, and therefore you can pack it tighter, and then you should consider it. We need more headroom when we're running a cluster that's not multi-tenant. And like obviously that's an anti-pattern for a lot of reasons, I think, but it's still like a thing that we've run into where we moved all of our workloads from a dedicated pool to a dedicated set of Kubernetes clusters, and we need more overhead in Kubernetes for deployments, sort of because of how the scheduler works.
Interesting. One of the things Doug mentioned earlier that I wanted to kind of bring back up again was the going from what everybody's developing in right now, like what does your develop environment look like as somebody on the JVM or whatever language, and then what does that look like into Kubernetes? I think we're going to see some pretty big pain points for software engineers going from, oh, I can just compile this and run it and everything's happy and I can like talk to my database and everything's good, to, well, what do you mean I have to make a container and ship it across a network? That seems like a lot of noise right now. I just want to develop like I've been doing it for all these years. Has anybody else seen that?
That's like my life. Not just with containers, but with everything.
Yeah.
Why do I have to do this? Why do I have to change anything?
Yeah, there can be a pretty steep learning curve for developers to just figure out how to still be as efficient and have short iteration times locally with Docker, so they can catch all their issues before they push them out.
Yeah. Now that Docker has Kubernetes built in, Sophia, I'm going to pick on you. Is that out to the public yet, or is that still being worked on? Do you know?
I believe it's been released since then.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it is in CE.
Oh, awesome. So I think that might help make this a little bit easier, is actually using Docker to get Kubernetes up and running on your local machine. So at least you can deploy to a cluster that way. I think if I remember correctly, there's like a button for it, the Docker icon in the top right corner. So it should be pretty straightforward.
Yeah, pretty much we've tried to make it as simple as possible. So.
Okay. So if you guys aren't aware of that, definitely check it out.
I'm curious, is that sort of the state-of-the-art development is still sort of laptop workstation based? or are people finding that something more of a cloud-based IDE is more suitable for container environment?
I think that's the $1 million question. I have my own, like as a software engineer working in Kubernetes, I have my own strong opinions, but I usually do things the hard way. I think most engineers I talk to, Minikube was the de facto for the longest time. And I think everybody's now is kind of really excited about the magic Kubernetes button in Docker. But there's a tool called Drafts that we did when I worked at Microsoft before Heptio that sort of makes the whole containerized process like easier, but I don't know if that's like what engineers want or how that's working for people. But I think it's kind of like uncharted territory at this point. Like everybody's kind of doing it a little bit different. Does anybody else have any really good patterns they want to share? I mean, I have a shell script, so I'm just going to be honest.
I've seen too many issues with developers checking and stuff that breaks on the Kubernetes side or in Docker, so I like to have them all tested locally. That's just my own personal opinion, though.
Okay, agree. I've also heard a lot of people talking about making applications deploy themselves. So actually writing the logic into your code base that will containerize your app and then deploy it to Kubernetes. I still saw that a lot in Go because the Kubernetes and Docker libraries are already there, so it made it a little bit easier. But sort of an interesting new phenomenon that I think we're starting to see in tech now that we're dealing with cloud computing.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So there was a project that I saw, I think Microsoft was heading called Brigade. It looked very promising because it seems like you can never get away from some type of scripted task system when you really want to get efficient. I was wondering if anybody's had any thoughts on something like Brigade or Brigade, which is JavaScript-based task, deployment.
The team that I work on at Rapid7, we were recently acquired from another company called Command. Literally, the product we build is, you could say it's sort of like for security products. So I have some experience with that type of approach, but not necessarily targeted on deployments if you wanted to talk offline.
We're out of time. I think this is a really great question for that resource we're talking about, which is the big ultimate question. What does everybody's dev cycle look like, and what is working for you, and why did you choose that route or fall upon it? And getting user stories and opinions and evaluations in one place for the community is going to be helpful. Is everybody kind of shaking their head? Okay, I'm going to add that as an action item. I'm going to do my best to get the scaffolding for this stuff in place, and where I can like color stuff in, I will. But friendly reminder, this is open source. Like, we need all of you guys to contribute and like help make this thing happen. And I'm going to go ahead and follow up and say we should do a follow-up call in, what, 2 weeks, 3 weeks? What does everybody think? I'm going to go with 2 or 3 weeks. I'll put it on Twitter, and I have everybody's email. So I'll put all that in an email list, and then I'll BCC you, and then you'll never hear from me again. And it'll just have a link to more information of how we're going to track this stuff more efficiently moving forward. Sound good to everyone?
Sounds great. Thanks for putting this together, Chris.
Yeah, thanks everybody. And if anybody wants to afterwards, I'll be here and we can just kind of make it informal. But I'm going to stop the recording now, and have a great week, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks all.